Back home, the snow felt like a hush button pressed on the world, and the porch light glowed warmer than memory. I came for pie, for old stories, and for the one truth I'd kept zipped inside my winter coat for years. What I didn't expect was finding love on Main Street between a tree lighting and a coffee refill. This is home for the holidays. Out for Good, a story about family, courage, and a kiss in falling snow. Tonight. If this story finds you, please tap subscribe, give a thumbs up, share with a friend, and join our conversation below. The first thing I noticed when I turned onto Cedar Avenue was how the streetlights wore halos in the snow, soft and golden like they'd been brushed on by hand. It had been years since I'd driven this road in December, and even though the hardware store had a new sign and the old movie theater had turned into a bakery, the curve of the street felt like a memory my hands somehow remembered better than my mind. I kept both palms on the wheel, knuckles pale, my breath fogging the inside of the windshield for just a second before the heat chased it away. Mom's voice had been in my ear the whole last hour, her tone bright the way it gets when she's nervous and trying not to show it. "Drive slow on the bridge," she'd said. "They never salt that thing properly." Then, a few minutes later, "Do you need me to set a place at dinner for anyone else?" She'd tried to fit that question into a laugh. I'd tried to pack an answer into a "no, just me" that didn't sound like a door closing. I love my mother, but conversations with her can feel like dancing around the corners of a room, both of us pretending the middle is occupied by something we don't need to discuss. This year, I'd promised myself I wouldn't leave the middle empty. The house looked exactly the same, the way the best kind of stories look exactly the same every time you open them. The porch sagged a little on the left from years of boots and birthdays. There was a brand new wreath, though, thick with pine cones and a red bow, and a single string of old-fashioned colored bulbs along the eaves. The ones Dad refuses to replace because he says the new ones don't have soul. I parked behind my dad's truck, but I didn't kill the engine immediately. I wrapped both hands around the steering wheel and just breathed for a minute, watching the snow turn the yard into parchment and listening to the engine hum like a held note. When I finally opened the door, cold came rushing in like a polite but insistent guest. I stepped out and stood on the gravel, stones shifting under my soles, and the smell of wood smoke welcomed me home. There are scents that undo you, that reach back through time and touch something you forgot was there. Pine, cinnamon, wood burning in the fireplace with the faintest sweetness of sap. My mom opened the door before I could knock. She had flour on her cheek and a grin that made her look 10 years younger. "There you are," she said, pulling me into the doorway so fast my suitcase bumped over the threshold. "You look thinner. Are you eating, Daniel?" She calls me Daniel. Nobody else gets to. Even I call myself Danny most of the time now, but here, in this house, I am Daniel. The boy who learned to tie his shoes on the third step and read stories under a quilt made from old Sunday shirts. "I eat," I said, laughing into her shoulder. With my face tilted down, I caught a whiff of her perfume, the kind that's been out of style so long it came back in again. "Promise." Dad was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove with the intensity of a man defusing a bomb. He glanced up, nodded once in that way of his that contained more love than it looked like, and said, "Hope you're hungry. Your mother invited half the street." He didn't have to say that he was glad I'd made good time. He didn't have to say anything because it was in the way his eyes crinkled at the corners and how he scooped me a spoonful of sauce and held it out like a handshake. We fell into a rhythm like we had never left it, setting plates, taste-testing too much of everything, adjusting the oven timer like it owed us money. The house was warm and busy, and when Aunt Lou and Uncle Hank came in the back door with a casserole that could probably feed a barn, I felt the edge of something inside me loosen. There is a grace to being known by people who held you when you had skinned knees, to being teased about things you thought you hid and praised for things you shrugged off at the time. It makes you braver, and it makes the truth heavier. The truth I was carrying like a gift I hadn't wrapped properly, afraid the corner would tear and someone would see. After dinner, after 1,000 little conversations that flowed like creeks and merged into a river, after dishes, after the good silver that never fails to tarnish no matter how many times it's polished, I found myself alone in the living room. The tree stood by the window, dressed but not yet lit. The ornaments were familiar, the wooden snowman with the broken left arm, the glitter-covered clothespin reindeer I made in second grade, the icicles that belonged to my grandmother and always felt fragile no matter how carefully you handled them. I plugged in the lights. They blinked to life with a flicker and then steadied, each tiny bulb taking its place in the constellation of this room. I stood there, letting my eyes rest on one ornament after another, and felt something like courage come up from my feet. Mom came in with 2 mugs of hot chocolate and handed me one without looking at me, because she's good at giving me space. "Tree lighting's at 7 on Main," she said. "You going?" "I thought I might," I said, wrapping both hands around the mug. The heat spread through my fingers and into my chest. "You remember the Andersons, boy?" Mom asked, still looking at the tree. "Evan, I almost choked on a marshmallow." I didn't need memory to bring Evan back. He lived in my head like a song that sometimes stopped playing but always started up again at the first snowfall. Brown eyes that saw more than he let on. A laugh that landed lightly but lingered. We'd been inseparable until life did what it does. The way a river splits and both branches still move forward, but lose the sound of each other for a while. "I remember," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Why?" "He's organizing the clothes drive by the gazebo," Mom said, like it was a casual thing, like it hadn't taken me 6 months to stop thinking about the last time I saw him. "They're calling it Out for Good, which I think is clever. Out of closets, out into the cold, out to the people who need it." She paused, and for a heartbeat, the room felt like a held breath. "He's a good man." "I know," I said. And even with the tree casting a soft light and the hot chocolate warming my hands, the cold that moved through me then had nothing to do with winter. It was fear and hope, neither of which ever asks permission before they sit beside you. On Main Street, lights twined around every lamppost like yarn spun from fireflies. The gazebo was decorated with a red and white banner reading, in cheerful block letters, "Out for Good," and beneath it were cardboard boxes lined up in straight rows with labels: coats, hats, gloves, blankets. Volunteers handed steaming cups of cider to anyone who came near. I walked slowly, taking in the sounds that only happen in December. The crunch of boots, the squeal of a child seeing a friend who has been out of school for precisely 3 hours and 20 minutes, the distant bells of the church because someone always forgets what time it is and rings them early. And then I saw him. There was a quiet, private moment between me and the world, where the snow seemed not to fall but to hover, and the sound of people talking turned into the hush of a radio turned down mid-song. Evan stood by the donation boxes, sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms that had lifted more than a few boxes today. He was older, of course we both were, but the features I remembered hadn't been replaced so much as accented by time. His hair was a little shorter, and there was a tiny scar at his hairline I didn't recognize, the kind of souvenir life gives you without asking. He laughed at something someone said, reached out to squeeze their shoulder, and then he turned and saw me. For a second, we were teenagers again. 2 boys who'd spent a whole summer inseparable, building forts in the scrubby woods behind his house, climbing the water tower even though we were both afraid of heights and pretending not to be, talking about cities we couldn't yet name and tastes we didn't yet know. We'd never said what we felt, not in words, but once, when we were 17 and the night was soft and full of crickets, he had reached out, all the space between us collapsing into a single, small, brave thing, and pressed his hand over mine. We both looked in the same direction that night, at a sky too big to hold with words, and breathed in time with each other. We had let that be what it was, a moment that said what we didn't know how to say. Then life pulled us, and we went. "Danny," he said now, and just hearing my name from his mouth did a strange thing to my balance. He stepped toward me with a smile that made me feel the way I did when I found money in an old coat pocket. Surprised and grateful, and like the world was more generous than I thought. "Hey," I said, because that's the kind of poise I bring to emotional reunions. He laughed, and it sounded exactly the same. "You made it home." "I did," I said. "And you made it home and then built something." "This is yours?" He shrugged, looking at the banner. Towns really, but I did push for the name, he said. Figured if we were cleaning out closets, we could put a little truth in the air. He didn't look at me when he said truth, and I didn't say anything about the weight of that word. Sometimes you let the small bridge build itself before you walk. We stood shoulder to shoulder, doing what people always do at the tree lighting, pretending we were there purely for civic pride and not because we wanted to bump into memories or make new ones. The mayor said a few words about community and generosity. A local quartet sang something sweet and a little off-key. Someone's dog in a sweater barked at the exact wrong times. The tree lights flicked on all at once, and the crowd gave a small, instinctive cheer that made my eyes sting because it was so ordinary and so beautiful. "Want to get a cup of coffee?" Evan asked. "Yes," I said, and it felt like a yes that was bigger than coffee. We walked to Maple and Steam, the coffee shop that used to be a hardware store, and I made a joke about how that meant somewhere there was a cappuccino machine built with a wrench that didn't quite fit. Inside, the air smelled like espresso and baked cinnamon, and the music was a soft jazz version of a carol that makes you miss things you don't even remember losing. We found a small table by the window, the glass etched with cold. The world outside looked like a postcard, and the world at our table felt like the opposite of a postcard. Less polished, but more real. We talked the way old friends do when they aren't sure yet what to say, taking turns asking about parents and jobs and common acquaintances, as if building a little scaffold of facts that could hold the weight of what we both avoided. Evan had taken over the family hardware store and turned it into something new without erasing what was old. A section in the back, where he still cuts keys and orders ancient screws for people who have ancient projects, but also shelves of modern tools, a wall of houseplants, and a register that rings up donations to local causes as easily as it rings up nails. He smiled when he talked about helping a kid build a birdhouse. He smiled when he talked about convincing old Mr. Galvin to try a battery-powered drill. He smiled when he talked about the Out for Good drive, and that smile lingered when he looked at me. "What about you?" he asked, stirring sugar into his coffee with a steady hand. "You ever figure out what you wanted to be when you grew up?" "I make books look good," I said, which is what I tell people when I don't want to try to explain that I design covers and work with authors who believe a color can change a life. I fell in love with the outside of stories and then realized that was its own kind of story. He nodded, and I remembered how he used to listen like the thing you said mattered. "You always liked the cover art," he said, and something about him using the word always made my chest warm. "You used to draw comic book covers for us, and we'd argue about which of our imaginary heroes was better at climbing the water tower. Our imaginary heroes were both afraid of heights," I said. "True," he said, his eyes crinkling. "But they climbed anyway. A family came in then, shaking off snow like dogs, and the little girl held out mittened hands to the barista like she was surrendering, and everyone laughed. I watched the domestic, sturdy sweetness of it, and something settled inside me. This was our town, in all its smallness and its surprises. This was where both of us had learned to be ourselves as much as we dared, and then learned the cost of daring too little. "Evan," I said, and my voice caught on his name. I took a breath, steadying myself like you do before stepping on a patch of ice you aren't sure is frozen solid. I came home for the holidays and decided I was going to be out for good. He looked at me then, fully, as if every other time he'd looked at me in the last hour had been practice. "Good," he said gently, like the word was a place I could sit down. "I'm glad. I'm not sure how it will go," I admitted. "I mean, my mom probably knows, and my dad, he's a good man, in the way that means the world can be confusing for him. He doesn't always say things right, but he tries. I'm not scared of them, I want them to keep seeing me the way they always have, but I want that me to include all the pieces now." He nodded. "It's a lot," he said. When I told my folks, I thought about nothing but the worst possible responses until I was sure I could weather them. They were awkward, of course. My dad said something about phases, and my mom asked if it meant I was moving away, as if who I love is a change of address. But time and holiday pies work together, he said, smiling. They made room for me. We left the coffee shop after we finished our drinks and stood under the awning. The snow falling in those fat, lazy flakes that looked like you could catch one on your tongue and write it a letter. We said goodnight the way people do when they're going to see each other tomorrow because he needed to get back to the drive and I had promised to help Dad bring the bins down from the attic. When Evan reached out to hug me, it wasn't one of those slap-on-the-back quick shows of affection either. It was real and warm, and I put my cheek against the wool of his coat and knew that this winter, this town, this holiday would be one of those markers in my life where things turned. Back at the house, Dad had already wedged himself halfway up the attic stairs, muttering about how the bins multiplied while he slept. He refused my help in theory, but took it in practice, as always, and soon we had the living room looking like a tinsel tornado had paid us a visit. We were unpacking the nativity set we've used since I was small, the little ceramic angel whose wing I glued back on with too much glue at age 9, still bearing the glossy ridge of my overenthusiasm. When Grandma Ruth knocked and came in without waiting for an answer, because that's what grandmas get to do. She was wrapped in a scarf knit so long ago it had returned to style twice, and she had those peppermint candies that seemed to be issued at birth to women of a certain age. She kissed my cheek and then stepped back to look at me like she was checking a painting she loved in different light. "You look like my boy," she said. "You look like yourself." "Thanks, Grandma," I said. And because I've never been good at hiding anything from her, I found myself swallowing hard. She watched me the way she watches the pies in the oven, patient and expecting goodness. "You're carrying something heavy, Daniel," she said. "You're about to put it down." I stared at her. And then we both laughed because there are some things that are true, no matter how you say them. "Come help me in the kitchen," she said, taking my hand like I was 5 and about to run into the street. In the bright light of the kitchen, with the smell of cloves and sugar and the sound of my parents arguing cheerfully over whether the turkey needed more pepper, Grandma set a teacup in front of me and poured. "I dated a girl once," she said, and my jaw almost unhinged itself. She smiled at my face. "In nursing school." Oh, don't look at me like the turkey learned to talk. We were quite modern in 1949. It was a kiss under an elm's tree and then life. Life was different then. But I never regretted knowing I was capable of that kind of love. The knowing felt like a little lantern I carried. You carry yours however you need to, but don't you hide it in the cellar. Love gets musty without sunlight. I think my heart did something between breaking and swelling. "Grandma?" I said, and that was all I could say for a minute, the word holding relief and gratitude and a kind of grief for all the times I'd been quiet when I wanted to sing. She patted my hand. "Tell them," she said. "They may fumble the ball a few times, but they'll pick it up and they will not drop you." The next morning, the sky was the white of paper, and we wrote our day on it with errands and laughter. I helped Dad shovel the walk and made 3 jokes about his back that were less funny when he nearly threw it. Mom sent me to the store for more nutmeg, and somehow I came home with a poinsettia because the cashier said, "Isn't it pretty?" With such conviction I didn't dare disagree. The town was full of familiar faces, and each one said my name with the polite amazement of someone who sees you where they care to see you, not just where you ended up. In the afternoon, I walked down to the river, a habit I've kept in every city I've lived in. Find the water, listen to it. The river that ran through this town wore a thin skin of ice along the edges but flowed dark and steady in the middle. I stood on the footbridge and watched a pair of ducks argue for 10 minutes about nothing at all. And then I watched the water and thought about my father teaching me how to skip stones here, the way he'd tell me to pick a flat one, to throw with my wrist, not my arm, to look where I wanted it to go. I thought about how often I had looked everywhere but where I wanted to go because I was afraid the wanting would show. That evening, I found Evan at the hardware store just as he was turning the sign to closed. He looked up and smiled, the kind you see with your whole chest. "You mind a visitor?" I asked, and he shook his head, opening the door wider. "I was about to make tea," he said. "You drink tea now, or are you still coffee only?" "I'm sophisticated now," I said. "I drink both like a man of culture." He poured water into a kettle and set it on a small hot plate in the back near the stockroom. The hardware store smelled like metal and lumber and, faintly, eucalyptus from a basket of soaps near the register. He moved with the ease of someone whose hands know their work. He handed me a mug with a chip on the rim, and I turned it to the smooth side, the way you do without thinking. We stood in an aisle full of old tools and new solutions and talked about things we hadn't let ourselves say the night before. He told me about the man he dated for a year who left not because of love, but because of distance. Because opportunities don't always map themselves to our hearts. He told me about the woman at church who brings him baked ziti, because boys can't cook, dear, and how he eats it and thanks her even though he can cook wickedly well. I told him about the authors whose books I'd loved too much to design objectively, about the joy of getting an email from a reader who bought a book because it caught their eye in a store window and then lost a week inside it. I told him about the weird silence in phone calls with my dad sometimes and how my mom once switched the subject to gardening so fast I got whiplash when I mentioned a man I was dating. We both laughed. We both got quiet. Sometimes saints and sinners sound exactly the same when you are trying to protect your tenderness. Come by the gazebo tomorrow, he said. We're sorting gloves. You always liked order. I like lines that make sense, I said. Gloves give you 98% success if you just match color and size. Until someone brings 3 left gloves and 1 right mitten, he said. Which is to say, you will never be bored. I showed up the next day with a bag of new socks and a scarf I had kept in a box because I never wore it but couldn't throw it away, bright blue like a summer sky. The town came out like it does, steady as a heartbeat. People dropped off coats that carried the ghosts of last winter's hopes, boots with stories in their scuffs, blankets that felt like hugs. Evan moved among them, remembering names, introducing me to everyone like I had never left. I found myself laughing with old teachers, with the boy who used to be a freshman when I was a senior, but was now a man with a deeper voice and a wedding ring. The day tilted toward evening, and a woman walked up holding a bundle wrapped in tissue paper like a secret. She placed it gently on the table and then opened it, and there were 2 small coats, barely bigger than doll clothes, achingly tiny with careful stitching around each button. My twins wore these their first winter, she said. They grew and I kept them because I needed to remember those days when everything else got too big. But I think someone else needs to be warm this year. Her eyes shone, and without thinking, I reached out and touched her hand. The world is full of holy moments that do not ask your permission to arrive. As we packed the last boxes for the night, the snow started again, fine as sugar. Evan and I walked toward the bakery, and on the way, he stopped and tilted his head, listening. They're singing carols on the church steps, he said, and we turned toward the sound. People stood in a rough semicircle, the old hymns and easy, wordless rope tying them to each other. I felt myself sway gently with the voices. I felt the weird ache in my throat that comes when you sing around people who know your history. Do you ever feel like you move so fast to get away that you forgot to take some things you needed? I asked. All the time, he said. But sometimes the things we need stay put and wait for us. We went back to my parents' house because Mom insists on feeding anyone I mention by name. She pulled Evan into a hug and then handed him a plate with the same seriousness she reserves for major announcements. Dad shook his hand and then set him a task, which is the purest form of acceptance my father knows. Soon, we were all in the kitchen peeling apples and talking about the weather with the intensity of people who know it can decide your day. After dinner, we sat in the living room by the tree. Mom put on holiday music that sounded like the soundtrack to a memory, and we watched the lights blink in their patient rhythm. Grandma Ruth had lined up the little ceramic figures of the nativity on the coffee table because she insists they need to be rearranged in a more accurate narrative arc, which is how she talks about pretty much everything. Evan, she said suddenly, eyeing him over her glasses. You single? I nearly swallowed my tongue. Evan grinned. Yes, ma'am, he said with that murmur of humor that usually helped him in tight spots. Very. She said and nodded. Smart, kind eyes. A man who helps strangers stay warm. Well, some people are worth waiting for. She glanced at me, and I pressed my lips together so I wouldn't laugh or cry. After Evan left that night, after the house had quieted and the lights were off except for the glow of the tree, because Mom always leaves it on as long as she's awake, I sat at the kitchen table with my parents. The steam from our tea made little flags in the air. I took a breath. Mom, Dad, I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear the part where I'm happy. They both looked at me with open faces. And I loved them so much I could count the freckles on my mother's cheek and the small scar on my father's left knuckle from when he was 16 and mischievous and tried to open a can with a screwdriver. "I'm gay," I said. The word fell into the air and sat there like a chair, solid, an invitation to sit down together. I've known for a long time and tried to carry it on my own because I didn't want to disappoint anyone. But it turns out, hiding is its own kind of disappointment. Mom reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "Oh, honey," she said softly, and her eyes were filling, but not with sadness. She lifted my hand and kissed the back of it like I was very small again and had scraped my skin on the sidewalk. "You're my boy. You've always been my boy. Nothing changes that." She looked at me, and her expression sharpened the way it does when she's angry at a thing that hurts someone she loves. "I'm sorry you carried it alone. I'm so sorry. I should have made it easier to tell me." Dad didn't speak right away. He looked down at his hands and then back up at me, and then he reached for his mug and took a drink and set it down carefully like he was thinking about something important. "I don't know the right words," he said slowly. "I'm probably going to say something dumb, but I know I love you. I know you are the same kid who would fall asleep with a book on his face and who hates sauerkraut but eats it when your mother makes it because you love her. I know you are kind and do the right thing. I don't know everything else, but I can learn. I want to learn." I hadn't realized how tightly I had been holding my shoulders until then. They sagged, and I let myself lean back in the chair and just breathe. The relief was so rich it tasted like chocolate. Grandma, who had been pretending to do the crossword, sniffed and said, "Well, that's settled," and then put down her pencil and came around the table and kissed both my parents on the top of the head like she was knighting them. We talked long into the night. There were questions, some clumsy, some thoughtful. There were pauses where the only sound was the soft thump of the dog's tail against the rug and the ticking of the clock on the wall. There was a moment when Dad said something about grandchildren, thinking out loud, and then caught himself and said, "That's none of my business unless you ask me to babysit," and I loved him so fiercely it made me catch my breath. The next day, my mother's texts were a stream of small hearts and reminders to wear a hat. My father came into the garage where I was looking for the extension cord and handed me a new snow shovel, because the old one's too flimsy, which is likely his way of telling me everything is going to be okay. Word in a town like ours travels in strange ways, but it didn't take long. The people who needed to know now knew, and they did what my parents had done. Some stumbled, some landed gracefully, but most of them kept their hands outstretched. A few days later, we had a winter storm. The kind the weatherman names like a family member, so you will treat it with the respect it deserves. The power flickered, went out, came back, went out again. The house took on the quiet of snow and candlelight. In the flickering light, Mom looked like a photograph I'd seen of her as a teenager, hair pulled back and serious but laughing. Dad told a story about getting stuck at the old Miller farm in a storm in 1982 and how he learned to walk backward in snow when it got too deep, because you could push your feet into your own footprints. Grandma told me again about the elms tree and her first love, and how she carried that lantern and then used it to light other corners in her life with my grandfather. Evan came over because, as he said when I opened the door, "Your mother told me to come before the roads. Get worse or she'd send a search party." He shook the snow from his hat and stamped his boots and then came inside the way you enter a place you want to. Belong. A little shy, a little certain. We sat close on the couch and talked about nothing. The best kind of nothing, board games, and the song that gets stuck in your head and whether it's acceptable to eat pie for breakfast. It felt like the world was giving us permission to slow down, as if everything had been sped up for years, and now, finally, we were moving at the speed of breath. That night, after everyone else went to bed, Evan and I stood on the porch, the snow whispering around us. The neighborhood was very quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a trust. He leaned against the railing and looked at me, the way you look at a painting you loved when you were young, and then you see it again and realize it still has new colors you didn't notice before. "I like the way you talk to your grandmother," he said. "I like how your mom puts an extra plate out just in case, and how your dad hums when he's thinking. I like that this house smells like cinnamon even when nobody's baking. I like you." I stepped closer and I could smell his coat, wool, and cold air and something that was just him. "I like you too," I said. And because we were adults, and because the snow was falling, and because my family was inside asleep, and because life is short and long and weird and beautiful, I reached out and put my hand over his, the way he had done years ago when we were 17. He turned his hand and twined his fingers with mine, and we stood there like that for a while. The simplest thing in the world, and I felt something inside me unclench, something I had been carrying like a heavy book. We kissed then, in the quiet. And if I were the kind to exaggerate, I'd tell you bells rang and the stars took a bow, but honestly, it was better than drama. It was warm and gentle and sure, and it felt like coming home twice in 1 week. When we broke apart, we both laughed a little, not because it was funny, but because our bodies needed to release the joy somehow. The storm moved on, and so did the holidays the way they do, a combination of urgency and timelessness. I helped Evan at the store, and he helped me decide that some traditions are just suggestions in fancy clothes. We went to the New Year's Eve celebration at the town square, and my father tried to convince me that his mulled cider recipe was superior to anything in a cookbook. We took down the tree and saved the softest pine needles in a bowl because the house missed the smell. I told stories to the little kids from the neighborhood who would wander in as if drawn by pie and music, because Mom's house still served both. A week after I told my parents, Dad and I drove to the hardware store to pick up a part for the faucet that had developed a leak as soon as I got home. As if the house needed a reason to keep us all around the kitchen table. We walked into a chorus of "Hey Ed," because my father is known everywhere like a man who delivers sunshine. The bell over the door made its familiar gentle ring. Evan was at the counter and Dad put the part down and said, calmly but like it mattered, "Evan's a good man," and I nodded. Because some truths just are, and you live in them like a house with sturdy walls. Later, Dad and I loaded bags of rock salt into the back of his truck, the plastic crinkling like winter applause. He leaned on the tailgate, exhaled, and looked at me. "You know," he said, "when you told us, I felt like someone handed me a book and I realized I'd been reading with a page stuck together. It didn't change the story. It just made sense of the parts that didn't." He kicked at a snow clump with his boot. "I'm sorry if you felt like you couldn't tell me. I'm glad you did. I don't want to miss any pages." I stood there and let my father's words settle into me, into that place where the fear had been, where the need for permission lives. "Thanks, Dad," I said, and it wasn't enough, but it was what I had, and it came from a deep well. He nodded, looked like he might say something else, thought better of it, and then bumped his shoulder against mine. On the morning of New Year's Eve, the Out for Good crew gathered at the gazebo for one more push. People came with bags of sweaters and socks, smaller crowds than before, but still steady. A teen boy I recognized only by his eyes, the rest of his face hidden behind a scarf, held up a pair of boots like a prize. "They'll fit," he said, as if the universe were a friend who needed to hear some enthusiasm. Evan handed him a pair of warm socks as if he were passing something sacred. We worked, then we packed up, the banner folded, the boxes labeled for delivery. In the quiet that followed, the gazebo empty and echoing with the ghosts of our steps. Evan stood with his hands in the pockets of his coat and looked at me like he was choosing something new in a store he already loved. "You going back after New Year's?" he asked, and the question was big but not heavy. "Yeah," I said. "I have deadlines and a boss who thinks winter is an excuse for everyone else to be lazier so the rest of us have to pick up the slack." He smiled. "I hate that for you," he said. "But you're good at what you do. And—" he hesitated, then offered something small and brave. "I've got the store."
"I'm not leaving."
"But I have some flexibility. I can visit." I thought about airports and snow delays, about FaceTime calls and letters with stamps that leave a little ink on your fingers. I thought about how we would make it work because we wanted to, and because this time around we weren't teenagers wishing on stars. We were two men who had spent enough time alone to know the shape of what we wanted. "We'll figure it out," I said. "And when I come home next time, it won't be just for holidays. It'll be home because it's where you are." We walked back to Maple and Steam, shared a slice of pie, argued about whether pecan is better than apple, though I maintain that's like comparing sunrises to sunsets. The barista wrote Happy New Year on the foam of Evan's latte with cinnamon, which I didn't know was possible until then. We sat and watched the town prepare to count down, watched the kids with glow sticks, the older folks with hand warmers, the way everyone leans toward possibility when the calendar flips. That night, just before midnight, the square filled with people wearing hats that made them look absurd and loved. The mayor took the microphone and gave a longer speech than necessary because that's what mayors do. Someone set off fireworks that should have been saved for the 4th of July, but they looked better against the snow. Evan and I stood near the back, close to the exit because both of us care about exits, but this time, neither of us wanted to use it. He took my gloved hand in his, and people noticed because we were, after all, in a town that notices things. A few looked at us, then back at the sky. One of my dad's friends nodded once, like he was doing math, and the answer came out right. A woman I hadn't seen since high school smiled and put her palm over her heart for a second, a gesture so tender I almost lost it. My parents found us. Mom kissed my cheek and handed me a sparkler because she insists we are never too old for light. Dad clapped us both on the shoulder. Grandma stood on the curb and yelled, "Somebody better drop something at midnight because if we don't drop something, it doesn't count." And a teenage boy next to her dutifully dropped his hat and then picked it up like he'd saved the year. We counted down together, the town's voice gathering itself into a single word. 10, 9, 8. I thought about the 10-year-old me who loved snow days and library books. The 19-year-old me who thought leaving would solve everything. The 29-year-old me who learned that leaving can solve some things and create others. 7, 6, 5. I thought about the soft trust of my mother's hand, the steady acceptance of my father's. 4, 3, 2. I looked at Evan, the way his breath made clouds in the air, and he looked back at me like a person who planned to keep looking. 1. The town cheered. Fireworks drew flowers on the sky and then erased them. Evan leaned in and kissed me, quick and sure, and the world did not tilt, and nobody gasped, and the church bells didn't ring because they'd already rung earlier by accident. It was ordinary. It was everything. It was ours. The next morning, the Out for Good banner hung in the store window, a reminder of what we had done, of how many small acts add up to warmth. Mom had replaced it at home with a small sign over the mantel, a piece of wood she'd painted by hand. The words neat and steady, "Home for the holidays, out for good." It made me laugh. Then it made me sit down because my heart had more gratitude than my legs could manage. Over pancakes, Dad asked Evan about his plumbing, which is to say he had decided he liked him. Mom passed the butter with the deliberation of a judge passing down a sentence. "May you always be fed." Grandma Ruth looked at us both like she was seeing sun through clouds, and then told us we should call her if we ever disagreed about the right way to make meatloaf because she had opinions. We promised we would. When it came time to drive back, the house did its usual thing where it tried to keep me by misplacing small items. My scarf hid under the couch. My gloves fell behind the bread box. Evan stood in the doorway, shifting his weight like he hated winter for the first time. Mom hugged me twice. Dad put an extra ice scraper in my trunk because he always buys them when they're on sale, as if preparing for the cold is his way of loving the world. Grandma tucked a peppermint into my pocket like a secret. In the car, I sat for a moment with the engine idling and looked at the house. The snow on the porch railing, the wreath, the light in the window. If I could paint, I would have painted it and spent a lifetime trying to get the shade of warm right. Evan leaned in the window and kissed me. It was quick and public and felt like a promise. "Call me when you get to the bridge," he said. "I want to make sure you remember to drive slow." We grinned at each other because we are both our mother's children. I drove away, the weight in my chest lighter, the road ahead steady. I felt like I had added something to myself rather than given something up. The town receded in the rear view and then settled itself somewhere I didn't even know you could carry a place. In that quiet center where you keep the things that are true. I turned on the radio to a station that plays old songs and sang along badly because there is something about singing alone in a car in winter that makes you forgive all your missed notes. On the bridge, I slowed because Mom was right and because slowing felt like respect. I called Evan and we talked about nothing for 5 minutes, about the weather and the weird Spotify ad I'd heard earlier, and whether it is appropriate to start thinking about spring in January. When I lost signal for a minute and the call dropped, I didn't panic because I knew the call would go through again. Sometimes that is what love feels like. Static, and then the click back, and then the familiar voice saying, "You there?" And you say, "I'm here," and both of you mean more than directions and time. Back at my apartment, the city felt faster and louder, and that was okay. I made tea in my chipped mug and sat on my couch and looked at the coat rack where my new scarf hung like a bright line of summer sky against winter. I took out a notebook and wrote down the names of the people we helped with the clothing drive. Not their real names, of course, just small notes. Child with red sweater. Woman with blue coat. Man with mismatched gloves. I wrote down the recipes I'd asked Mom to text me. I wrote down that my father had leaned on a truck and told me he didn't want to miss any pages. Then I wrote down the words, "Home for the holidays." Out for good in big letters because I wanted to see them on paper. They looked right. When Evan called that evening, I put him on speaker and cooked while we talked. I told him about the neighbor's dog that howls when ambulances go by, about the diner on the corner that had started serving chili at half price to anyone who brought a donation to a food bank. He told me about Mrs. Tremaine, who had cried when she found the boots fit, about the city plow that had politely avoided the pile of rocks he'd placed at the curb to protect the saplings. He told me about a customer who came in for a screw and left, with a story about his father's snowblower and the time it took out a set of Christmas lights in a dramatic act of rebellion. We ended the call the way you end calls when you are in that sweet beginning and also in that sober middle. "Good night," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Good night," I said back. And then because I could, because it mattered, because out for good means saying the truth when it is quiet and when it is loud, I added, "I love you." There was a pause, but not the kind that makes your stomach drop. It was only him taking a breath that felt like we were both stepping into a room we had been standing outside for years. "I love you too," he said, the words landing softly in my apartment like snow on the windowsill. I went to bed, and the city was noisy in the way cities are. But I slept, like I was in a quiet town with a tree that needs rearranging and a grandmother who knits honesty into everything she touches. In the morning, I opened my eyes, and the first thing I saw was the scarf on the chair, bright blue, and I thought, all right, let's go be the truth again today. Every holiday since then has felt like a little ceremony where we retell the story. Not every part of the year is easy. There are conversations that still stick, and judgments from people who have never washed a stranger's coat and warmed their hands with hot coffee while doing it. There are days when the distance between my city and his town feels like more than miles. There are also days when a video call carries the sound of his laugh like a string between our houses, and days when he shows up on my doorstep without warning, smiling like he's caught a good wind. But when the cold comes and the lights go up, and the town banner that says "Out for Good" finds its way back to the gazebo, we stand together. We hold hands. We drop off coats and stories. We watch the tree light and cheer with the rest of the river of people. My mother presses a peppermint into my palm and kisses my cheek. My father teaches a kid how to shovel properly, as if he's passing down a sacred art. Grandma Ruth tells the same story because it's worth telling, and some stories get better in the retelling because we keep finding ourselves in them. Home for the holidays. Out for good. It turned out to be a sign above a mantel and a banner in the snow and a declaration in a kitchen and a quiet kiss on a porch. It turned out to be a way to live. And if you've ever felt the weight of a truth you were afraid to put down, if you've ever stood on a familiar street and looked at a familiar face and wondered if this time you could say it out loud, I want to tell you, there's a place at the table. There's a light in the window and your chair has been waiting. Come in from the cold. Tell them who you are. And when the snow falls, step out into it, hand in hand with someone you love, and know that sometimes the bravest thing is not leaving, not arriving, but staying right there in the center of the room. Exactly yourself, out for good.